Aloha, everyone. Welcome to Oahu Democrats. Let's talk story.
Aloha to everybody who's attending. Tonight, we're going to discuss the very important topic of a woman's right to choice. And we have a distinguished guest with us, Representative Della, and she's going to tell us a little bit about herself, and then we're going to delve right into that important topic, the woman's right to choose. I'm Daphne Barbee-Wooten. If you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll get to it towards the end. And thank you for attending. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Della Avaletti. Della, welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Yes, it's wonderful. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from?
Sure. So again, my name is Della Belatti. I currently represent Makiki Tantalus area in the beautiful state of Hawaii on the wonderful gathering place of Oahu. I also serve as the House Majority Leader, which I feel very grateful to be able to do to lead the Hawaii House of Representatives, along with the leadership team of Speaker Scott Saiki, Vice Speaker John Mizuno, and House Majority Floor Leader Dee Morikawa. I've been in the legislature since 2006. It's hard to believe, 15 years serving in the legislature. But by way of background, I also practice as a civil rights attorney. And then even before that, I served and was a high school social studies teacher. So I have a little bit of a longer career than some other politicians, but I really enjoy public service and representing my community.
Are you originally from Oahu?
Yes, born and raised back in Manoa Valley. And I literally went away to college, came back, and then settled within 5 miles of my home, and now represent the urban Honolulu area of Makiki and Tantalus.
That's wonderful. Now, are you also part of the Hawaii Legislators Women's Caucus?
Yes, the Hawaii Women's Legislative Caucus is a very vibrant group. We are a bipartisan group in the legislature of women elected in both the House and the Senate. We focus on issues of common interest, and oftentimes that focuses on things like sex assault, sex harassment, ensuring women's access to health, issues of family planning, as well as education. So we're a very diverse group, and it's a very active group that works and engages with community stakeholders to identify issues important to women, children, and families.
How many women are in the Women's Political Caucus?
Oh, I should know this. I'm going to go this very quickly, but I believe we're at about 25% of the legislature. I will get back to you on that. Let me look at that real quickly.
Okay, now, can you tell us some of the bills that the Hawaii Legislators Women's Caucuses support, endorse?
So every year we work with community stakeholders to identify issues, and then we work with our own women legislators, and we come up with a package. In recent years, we focused on access to women's health care. We've again focused on Title IX, improving situations. We passed emergency care for sex assault victims, so emergency contraception, EC in the ER. So those are some of the issues that we focused on. Now, some of these issues don't get widespread the Women's Legislative Caucus support because it is a bipartisan group, but we do try to find ways in which we can work together to identify those issues of common ground. So we have passed.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. So we've passed, ensuring access to contraceptives, to family planning services, to STD testing and screening. Those are some of the measures that we've been able to focus on and get bipartisan support for.
And I also understand a couple of years ago, the Women's Legislative Caucus also enacted sex harassment, anti-sex harassment rules and regulations for the legislature, right?
We were part of the efforts, especially as the Me Too movement got a lot of ground, to help and ensure that the House and the Senate did have their procedures in place. I would not say, though, that it was purely just a Women's Legislative Caucus effort. I really would say that it was a commitment by all of the leadership. And so I think what's helpful, though, is that you have an active Women's Legislative Caucus that is pushing for reforms. Another really important area of work that we focused on has been on domestic violence. And I don't want to put that aside because that's actually been an area where we've had lots of community conversations across the state. And there's currently a domestic violence pilot program that we're looking at that will help to really look at the family and ensure that people who get caught up in domestic violence are actually diverted to programs and services, because really it's about fixing and making sure that the entire family is healthy.
That's true. Now I'd like to ask you questions about a woman's right to choice. Just recently, the legislature and the governor signed a bill, and it was House Bill 576 and Senate Bill. Tell us a little bit about this bill.
So House Bill 576 is about making sure that there's access to medication abortion that can be administered by advanced practice registered nurses. This is really, really important and critical for our island state because we know there are so few providers across the state and we also know that medication abortions or abortions by aspiration are very safe procedures that can be done by APRNs who are trained to do so. So this was a bill about expanding access to abortion care services. Under the previous law, abortions were required only to be performed by a licensed physician or surgeon or licensed osteopathic physician. So this really is about expanding those care providers who can provide this very safe procedure throughout the community and really provide access to our neighbor island women.
Yes, Hawaii was one of the first states, actually was the first state to legalize abortion in section 45316 Hawaii revised statute. And so Hawaii really is in the forefront of protecting women's right to choose. So basically the bill was signed by the governor recently in April, is that correct?
Yes. And so it really, in the time of COVID, I think, healthcare services became very, the access to healthcare became even more critical. So I think, we were very proud that this bill was Act 3 of the last legislative session. We took care of some very important unemployment access issues, as well as budget issues. But this really was a commitment by the State House and Senate to prioritize women's health care. And so, the Women's Legislative Caucus, the picture you see there is with myself and Senator Roz Baker, who is the Senate co-convener of the Women's Legislative Caucus, as well as Laura Reichart of Hawaii Center for the State Center for Nursing, and then Dr. Rennie Soon, who is a very strong advocate for women's healthcare in the community. And so this was a really important bill, I think, for us to pass to show our commitment to ensuring, safe care to women across the state.
Have there been women who have needed access to medical care for abortions, neighbor islands, and who have been benefited from this law?
We believe so, yes. One of the things that we learned through the testimony, of course, was that Hawaii already has a shortage of healthcare providers. So in this very specialized area of care, even more so, women in rural communities don't have the same access to the doctors and physicians that we have here in urban Honolulu. And so it was really important for this bill to be passed. And we also know that Maui and Oahu are very well served by Planned Parenthood, but there are other providers that are needed on Kauai and the Big Island. And so we know that women are going to be served, but this isn't just the end of it. And we can talk about later, there are so many more things we can do to ensure that there is family care planning services throughout the state, especially for our rural communities.
Was Hawaii the first state to pass such a bill, or are there other states that have similar bills allowing nurse practitioners or advanced degree nurses to perform abortions?
I believe we're among some of the first states, but we were not the first state. So there's always a series of kind of the blue states that go first. And I believe we're in the first set of those states, but we weren't the first, not on this one.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about a little bit about what's going on nationwide. As we know, Roe versus Wade in 1973, the Supreme Court said that a woman has a right to choose whether or not to have an abortion, and that this was an important right to be protected. And since 1973, it has been the law of the land, at least in the United States, that you can have an abortion as long as, according to the term, it's viable, the fetus is not viable. The term is viable. And recently, there's been a lot of challenges, especially this year. Let's talk about the Texas law first. What do you think about the Texas law, and how does that impact Hawaii?
The Texas law frightens me. It really scares me because of the provisions of banning abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, not allowing for exceptions, and also for the portion where it criminalizes the action and then allows essentially individuals to report others for aiding and abetting an abortion. And I just think that this Texas law really is an overreach, and really it just makes it almost impossible for women in Texas to be able to have access to a safe abortion. Now, how does it impact Hawaii? It doesn't. So luckily we live in a blue state, and this law, and certainly elements of this law might get introduced into the state legislature, but I do not believe that there would be support for this. And so that's one of the things about abortion law in the United States, is that the right to regulate abortions really resides with the states. And that's what Roe v. Wade essentially set forth. But even that is coming to the challenge.
Yeah.
That's what we have to be concerned about.
Right, we do have to be vigilant about this. And with regards to the Texas law, I understand that people are going to be rewarded with $10,000 if they report on someone who is even thinking about getting an abortion, which is pretty scary. So if someone goes in Texas and say, hey, come on to Hawaii, they could be charged. Come to Hawaii if you need an abortion, they could be charged. But other women who just travel across state lines.
You know, I think people are saying that Uber drivers could be responsible, and that they could be held responsible, and that they should have to be part of reporting. And so just this framing of the law and this use of the law to pit neighbors against neighbors for what is essentially a medical decision. A medical decision between a woman and her doctor or her provider is just crazy.
And I understand that there was a doctor who announced that he did perform an abortion in Texas, welcoming lawsuits so that it can be challenged once again. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court did not rule on the constitutionality of this Texas law. Why do you think that is?
Well, you know, there's discussions, right, about the shadow docket of the United States Supreme Court, and this is their way of, you know, just pushing it off and making sure that, you know, this law has an opportunity to take root. And I think there was some kind of, you know, there was mention of some complex issues that needed to be briefed, but honestly, this was really just an egregious abdication of their responsibility to protect the constitutional rights of women in the state of Texas. I think there's been swift and immediate reaction. There was a very strong dissent by Justice Sotomayor. So while we dearly miss Justice Ginsburg, you know, there are still members of that court that are going to dissent, but the numbers simply are not with, I think, on this issue, with the women's right to choose. And so that ultimate question might actually be determined in another case. And so really what the Supreme Court was doing was priming and setting the stage for the Mississippi case, which is coming
Right.
up.
And that case is called Jackson Women's Health Organization versus Dobbs. And it's going to be heard by the United States Supreme Court December 1. It's right around the corner. Anybody can get on the US Supreme Court docket on the website and actually listen to the arguments. But it is very scary. And I was reading a little bit. First of all, the Fifth Circuit issued an opinion that said the Mississippi law invaded a woman's right to choose, which of course I agree with. But taking it up to the US Supreme Court and the Supreme Court stating that they're going to hear arguments, unlike what they did in the Texas case, means something big is about to happen, something explosive. And we just have to watch and see. But in addition to watching and seeing what's going to happen, I just want to mention that the Attorney General of Hawaii has filed an amicus brief, which means a friend of the court. And she is joined by the Attorney Generals of California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, Virginia, Washington, Wisconsin, Washington, D.C., North Carolina. So there are a lot of states who are joining the side to say, do not destroy Roe versus Wade, do not undermine Roe versus Wade, to keep Roe versus Wade as a stare decisis, legal called stare decisis, keep it as a precedent. So Hawaii joins with these other states in that. So Della, what do you think is going to happen?
I don't think it's very likely that we will have a favorable decision. And I think just with the composition of the court, with the signaling of kind of the shadow docket, I think that we're in for some very difficult times, depending on how this court rules. So a little bit, two differences. So the Texas law that the Supreme Court punted on is basically a ban after 6 weeks of pregnancy. So it's actually far worse than the Mississippi case, which is a 15-week ban. And that 15-week ban is already enacted in a number of other states, including Louisiana. It's just the questions that are going to be raised. And then, the chance of Roe v. Wade being undermined is just very real. I don't think there's nothing else to say about that. And so it's gonna be thrown to the states, right? So that's the general framework of Roe v. Wade, which is to say that the states can regulate, but if they determine on the issue, I think, of viability and say that they can impose this 15-week ban, then women in red states will just not have the access that other women do. And it will be very challenging.
Right, because under Roe versus Wade, I read some cases and medical information that said viability under Roe versus Wade is usually 24 weeks, approximately 24 weeks, the first trimester. And so the Mississippi case would turn it back to 3 months, maybe even less, depending on the circumstances. But you're of the mind that even if they do cut back Roe versus Wade, that abortion will still be available. A woman will still have the right to choose. It's just that she'd have to leave some of the red states and go to the blue states where it's more available. That's your opinion.
Yes, it's going to be that abortions will not end in the United States, but it's going to be left to states to determine how to regulate it. And there will just be greater restrictions in red states. And yes, it becomes an issue for it's going to hurt those women who aren't able to travel. So it's going to hurt those women in disadvantaged, lower income communities. And I think that's part of the devastation of this.
Mhm. And then just yesterday, the U.S. Congress passed a law, bipartisan basis, where the Democrats voted on the Women's Health Protection Act to keep abortion, to make sure that a woman has a right to choose. But it now goes before the Senate. How do you see the outcome of this bill?
Well, I'm grateful that we have Vice President Senator Kamala Harrison, or Vice President Harrison, who can be the tie-breaking vote. So I think it's critical that the Senate move quickly, but I also think it's going to be difficult in the Senate. So we need to watch and see how fast the Senate can move. The vote in the House was 218 to 211. So, on party lines. It's interesting because I'm trying to, I haven't seen the actual text of the Women's Health Protection Act, but I understand that it creates a new legal protection for providers to provide abortion care, and that for their patients to receive care free from medically unnecessary restrictions and bans on abortions. So hopefully this might actually take the question away and say that these bans are not legal. I just don't know how that's going to intersect with the current litigation before the Supreme Court. So I haven't seen the actual text of the Women's Health Protection Act. And again, it still has to get passed by the Senate.
Right. And then what can people do to ensure a woman's rights to choose are protected? Can they call senators? I know at least I believe, I know Senator Hirono is in favor. But anyways, what can we do? Can we call other senators in other states and ask that they support?
I think one of the best things that the Oahu Democrats did that I saw during the election was they called their friends in other states to call their senators. And so that's what needs to happen. I think if you have friends who live in those states that might have senators who are wavering, the message has to get out to these senators that women are an important voting bloc. The men that support women are an important voting bloc. And so we need to make sure that this law gets passed, because it will then stop states from being able to impose these types of 6-week and 15-week bans and mandatory delay periods. If Congress is silent on these types of laws, it will be the Supreme Court, an unelected body of people, a very select small group who will be able to determine this very, very important issue. So I would urge Democrats everywhere to call their friends who are Democrats in other places to call their senators. Hawaii is safe. Senator Brian Schatz and Senator Mazie Hirono are our champions on this issue in Hawaii, in Congress. And so I don't doubt where they will stand, but we need to get other senators to move. The other thing I would also urge people to do, and this is a little bit more of a longer reach, but President Biden did set up a commission that looked to make a report about reforms to the Supreme Court. And I do believe, what we have seen over the last 30 to 50 years was a dedicated effort, a very dedicated effort by people who are very passionate on the other side of this issue for abortion care to essentially get the court that we have today. So the conversations around the Supreme Court and how we might reform the Supreme Court, how we might reform rules in the Senate around advise and consent are very critical conversations that we need to be a part of. And so I would encourage people to look up the Biden's Presidential Commission on SCOTUS. It conducted public meetings. They are taking public comment, but there are so many issues of this sort where this court could overturn long-standing decisions that do not favor individuals and rights of privacy and, the right to organize. Go down the laundry list of environmental protections, of everything that Democrats hold, to be very important. And you will see that the Supreme Court may be backtracking on a lot of these things. So the conversation about Supreme Court reform is important, and we should weigh in it. We should weigh into that conversation, lean into that conversation. And then on the issue of encouraging our own senators to think about reform for the Senate. The filibuster. If our major legislative proposals get stopped up because of arcane rules in the Senate, we need to think about ways. And I'm actually a little bit agnostic about this because I don't know. I don't think that holding up legislation is correct. But I think there needs to be a conversation about that because there's too much of the Democratic agenda that is being held up potentially by too few of a group, and that in order to move the Democratic agenda, some of these kinds of arcane rules have to be revisited.
Yes, and speaking of the Supreme Court rolling back on rights, I know that they rolled back on the Voting Rights Act, and as a consequence, I think the U.S. Congress is trying to get past the John Lewis Voting Rights Act again. I'd like to be optimistic and say that maybe they'll punt on the Jackson Women's Health Org, but the fact that they want to hear it is very telling as to what could happen.
Daphne, can I say one thing? Can I say one thing? Just because it's an action item, and you mentioned the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. At the end of the day, the next election is the most important thing that anybody can do. I think when you see the systematic way in red states where methods to suppress the vote, legal methods to suppress the vote are being enacted in these states, the only way we take our votes back is to vote. That's the only way. And people did it during the civil rights movement. People are going to have to do that now. And so as difficult as it may be, because the rules are going to be made tougher, you're not going to be able to give water to people in line. You're not going to be able to, walk in your vote after a certain time or date. People, once the rules are set with whatever Voting Rights Act that gets passed, we as Democrats need to learn what those rules are, and then we need to get our voters out. That's the bottom line, because it will be at the polls that we win. The wrangling at the Supreme Court is very important. I don't want to diminish that. We need to keep working to appoint good judges. But at the end of the day, it's in the power of the vote, and then who we send to Congress that will make all the difference.
That's true. And just going back a little bit to the Supreme Court, what do you think of stacking? What do you think about President Biden stacking the Supreme Court and putting other justices on? Because certainly I think what happened, my opinion, of course, is that it was stacked in favor of the Republicans and the right-wing side of the Republicans. And that's how they got to the point we're at now, with people cutting back on Voting Rights Act and possibly doing away with Roe versus Wade. What is your opinion?
I think I agree. I mean, I think the ways in which the Senate was so disciplined when it was controlled by the Republicans to not allow Obama his ability to appoint a very competent person to the court, highly qualified person to the court. I think they used tactics in which to unstack the court. So I think when you look at it on the whole, I think there's a case that we should reform and add justices.
What will it take besides the vote?
What will it take? The court has not always had 9 justices. I think it's fluctuated, right? So it's not impossible to imagine that there will be more justices, but it will be a difficult lift. It will be a difficult lift to do that. And so I don't know how successful we will be. But again, my view is that it's now such a politicized court, and we have to recognize that the way in which the Supreme Court is created has always been political. So we need to use those levers if we need to. And clearly, the Republicans, when they were in power, were so disciplined at blocking judges, and even when they were not in power, you know, the Democrats were quite too nice, right? They would recognize the courtesies. And I think at this point in time, it's been very clear what the tactics of the Republican conservative wing has been. And so we need to look at that and examine that, and then take those steps that are reasonable and measured and justified. And I think that's why the Biden's commission on the Supreme Court is so important.
Right, because there is no law that says it has to be 9 justices.
No,
It's not in the Constitution, the number of justices that have to sit on the Supreme Court. So frankly, he can just do it, can't he? Can't he just do it? What's preventing him?
well, I don't know.
Well,
if he
these
can
are just
do it. I'd have to, you know what?
There's no law that says you can't, you know?
No, but I do think, you know, I don't know if I think there has to be some other step taken to add it.
And then it would have to be up to the Senate to approve, and then that's where the argument would come in, right?
Yes. It's
No,
not
I think
something
he should appoint. I think he should appoint Michelle Obama. I think
Oh.
the Senate would be too afraid. They'd be too afraid to vote her down. Well, my opinion, of course. Yeah. Anyways, so Della, what can people do politically to keep the right to choose for women in the United States?
Well, okay, let me talk about Hawaii first.
Okay.
You know, we need to continue to elect legislators who support a woman's right to choose and believe in that. And so I do want to point out, you know, Daphne, you mentioned the state AGs wrote an amicus brief on the
Fair
case.
counter, yes.
Yes. So there was actually another amicus brief, and there's so many people weighing in on this case. There are so many amicus briefs are friends of the court, right? And there was a brief that was submitted by state legislators, over 900 state legislators across the country. I thought I had signed on to it. I thought I had like put my name in and like submitted it, but I sadly my name wasn't on it. But I do want to make a shout out to my colleagues who did sign on to this amicus briefs, Senator Laura Casio, Senator Roz Baker, Senator Stanley Chang, Senator Linda Coit, Senator Gil Keith Agaran, Michelle Kidani, Chris Lee, Bennett Nisalucha, Carl Rhodes, and Miley Shimabukuro. So 10 of our senators signed on to this amicus brief, and then 8 of our representatives also signed on to it. So Representatives Linda Ichiyama, Janae Capella, Matt Lopresti, Nicole Lowen, Lisa Martin, Nadine Nakamura, actually Senator Joy San Buenaventura, and Representative Tina Wildberger. So we had 18 legislators who were able to sign on to this amicus brief. And it's super critical here, because I will share with you, you know, as strong as our Democratic Party is here, there are bills that get introduced that threaten women's right to choose. We heard several years ago a bill, I can't even remember what it's called anymore, but it was it was a bill that caused quite a bit of havoc in the House Health Committee. And so there's always measures that come in that threatens a woman's right to choose. I think it would have made it potentially, the bill that was discussed would have made it potentially criminal for abortion care providers to be able to even provide. There was a right. I'm looking at Ann Fried. Ann, you're on this call. Remember that bill? I can't even remember what it was, but it wasn't a good bill. It would have eroded a woman's right and access to abortion care here in Hawaii. So we do have those measures that get introduced. You know, 30% of the population did vote for Donald Trump here in Hawaii. And so we have to be vigilant here to make sure that a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to privacy is and continues to be respected. Now, we're lucky here in Hawaii because we have much stronger privacy protections under the Hawaii state constitution. The challenge is that if the right to life gets redefined, or the right of the fetus is trumps over the right of the woman to choose at some point because of the viability issue, that's where it will become very problematic, that even under our strong state constitutional privacy protections, that we may fall under some of the stricter regulations that could be imposed. And so then it will be important that our state legislators are supportive of the woman's right to choose. So I've forgotten the question already. So
what can people do to politically to keep the right to choose for women? Make sure that the right is not eroded and taken away. And even if the Supreme Court rules against or rules in favor of the Mississippi law, there's still things that people, well, not just women, but people can do.
So politically,
what are some of those things?
Yeah, some of the other political things, again, urging the people and friends in other states to vote for legislators who are supportive. I think tactically on the ground, what people can do, support groups that support the woman's right to choose, support those healthcare providers who are going out into community to not just provide, abortion care services is just a sliver. Abortion care services is just a sliver of what these healthcare providers are doing out there to help women and children and families access care. So help the Planned Parenthoods, because you know what? Planned Parenthood also does a great job about counseling about what the full option is available to women. Yes, it might be abortion care, but it could also be, how do you take your child all the way to term in a healthy environment? How do you have a healthy pregnancy? Planned Parenthood and all of these groups also do very, very important things, educating young women and young men as to what their options are. And I will say, again, comprehensive, medically accurate sex education will be the best way for us to deal with this issue of abortion. The thing that many people don't know is that in this time when we've had Roe v. Wade, abortion rates have actually been going down, because in many states, the rates of abortion are going down because there is more education. People are more educated about what their options are. And so, there's fewer actually unwanted pregnancies in this time of Roe v. Wade. And so I think those are the kinds of other tactical things, I don't know if it's political things as so much as it's community things that we can do to strengthen our young women and men out there.
Well, thank you. What about protests? We've seen in the past women protesting, even here in Hawaii in 2017. And I do see on CNN occasionally that they show women protesting near the Supreme Court. Do you think that the Supreme Court listens, or does this help?
I think anytime any group of well-meaning people want to get together and raise their voice on any issue, frankly, on any issue, that's a good thing for democracy. So particularly on this issue, protest is wonderful, I think. Now, does the court listen to it? Courts are insulated and they're designed to not be affected by these things. But in many ways, these big issues of the day, they are listening. They can't help but listen. So I think to raise our voice collectively is very important. I think also to protest and to talk about these issues is important just for legislators and lawmakers and policymakers to get across the point that people care about this issue and they care about all facets of this issue. Again, it's not just about abortion care. It's about access to Medicaid services so that you can have all of these other wonderful services to make sure that your family is healthy, that your community is healthy. And so whenever anyone gathers together, and I was part of the Women's March here in Hawaii.
Yes, we have photos. We have photos showing you and
I think
women.
We have to do that. We have to do that so that we show and demonstrate that we are a political force. And so very important for us to do that. In this time of pandemic, I will say it's important to do it also very safely though. So
Oh,
wear a
yes.
mask,
Well,
wear a
most
mask,
definitely.
you know,
And
your sign
good.
and march in a socially distant way. I love it. I think we should definitely do that.
Well, I'd like to thank our guest, Della Belatti. I'd like to thank Lorna Strand. And we have a little slideshow and we'll get ready to answer your questions. One other thing is there is, I understand, a march that's going to happen October 2nd by the Capitol here in Hawaii. And it's a protest by women and it's for the women's right to choose. 9 o'clock, the Capitol, October 2nd. I think that's next Saturday. Oh, it's just a real slideshow showing some of the protests that we had in the past, and of course, honoring Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Mind your own uterus. That was one of my favorite signs, mind your own uterus. And so now we'd like to take questions. Questions or remarks? I think there were a couple.
So far, I only found 2 in the chat. Yeah, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to submit them to the chat and we'll write it out over here.
Okay, Della, you see the first one. Any chance the U.S. Senate will revoke the filibuster to pass the House bill which codifies legal abortion?
I'm not the best person to ask that question of. I mean, I hope they do, but that's a question more appropriate for Senator Hirono and Senator Schatz.
I hope that they are able to change the filibuster. Again, I think your suggestion about contacting people to contact Joe Manchin, and whose Democratic name, and to see if he will support getting rid of the filibuster. And I think that you got to keep trying. Got to keep trying. Okay, the next is, with the sheer number of cases and now the backlog from the pandemic, the federal courts seem overwhelmed. Is there a chance, is there a way for Congress to expand the number of the federal trial and appeal courts? Should the Democrats be fighting for this instead of stacking the Supreme Court? Della?
That's a great question. And I think there's always been a conversation about expanding the number of federal trial and appeals courts. I think I understand that the Ninth Circuit is one of the largest circuits and certainly would make sense. But again, it's a very political act. That move to expand the federal courts, I think, is well justified potentially. But again, it has to go through Congress. So getting that expansion passed would be again monumental. And there's always been calls for that. But again, especially with the Ninth Circuit.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions that they can just vocalize it? We'll recognize you. Christopher Edwards.
Oh, I was just agreeing that we need more federal judges, and that we don't necessarily have to split the courts and create an additional court system, but just hire more judges to work in all of the federal courts that we already have, because we do have backlogs. We did have backlogs before the pandemic, and now we have greater backlogs. They've been doing a lot more, I think, virtually, which is probably a positive for the system. But the immigration judges, most especially, we need more of, because that backlog is insane for asylum seekers and things like that. It would create a lot of jobs, and not just for the judges themselves, who are, paid well enough, but also all of their clerks and all of the employees that work in the federal court system in all of these different jurisdictions across both the South with the southern border, as well as other parts of the country where people are flying in and seeking asylum, or coming into the country in other means. I think it could be rather helpful to have more judges around, which also then leads to more feeder judges who can move into appeals and then one day move into the Supreme Court as well. Just having more judges around is probably in the best interest of the nation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Daphne,
Anybody?
I wanted to follow up on that question about the Women's Legislative Caucus. So I quickly scribbled and tried to figure out all the names. We actually have 25 women now in the House and the Senate. And I believe we have 9 senators and 16 state representatives in the Women's Legislative Caucus. And when Senator English retired from Maui and Senator DeCoit was elevated, we picked up another female representative with Representative Linda Clark, representing Molokai, Maui County. And so we're adding our numbers. So 25 out of 76, that's pretty darn good.
That is good.
It's very good for women's representing, being represented in the legislature. And I think, again, that's a very solid group. Again, we don't agree on all things. Sometimes the issue of abortion care, access to abortion is something that we don't agree upon, but we do try to find common ground. And a lot of times we do find common ground on women's broader healthcare issues.
Okay. Thank you. Well, if there's no more questions, let's show the picture of Della with Ruth Bader Ginsburg behind her when she gave her speech about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If you can get that photo back up. And thank everybody for coming and showing an interest. And let's keep women's right to choice alive.
Thank you, Daphne, and thank you to Oahu Democrats for having me here to talk story.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much. We did stop. We stopped the recordings on Facebook Live as well.